Well, happy Thursday again, friend. If you're listening real time, happy May. This is one of my favorite times of the year because May is my birthday month and it always feels like a little New Year's-y. I'm one of those people, probably because my birthday is near the middle of the year, that I always feel a very strong sense of New Year's reset, clean slate vibes around my birthday. So I am offering that energy to you today. If you want to jump on board, May is full of possibility. It's a great opportunity for a reset and good vibes, birthday vibes. We're going to start off the vibes with a conversation that is a long time coming. And we're going to have more than one conversation on this because there's a lot to talk about on the subject of self compassion. Don't adjust your dials. I promise this is vital to your decision mastery. I know you can go look up on the internet and on a ton of other podcasts, conversations about self compassion and what is it and how do we do it and blah, blah, blah. You're going to get some of that here. You're going to get some of the basic info here. We're also going to talk specifically, though, how self compassion is a non negotiable element in your decision success. You've heard me right. Your ability to make powerful, authentic, self honoring decisions is directly correlated to your ability to exercise self compassion. So it's not just a nice idea. It's not just one of those floofy sayings that maybe in retirement, when I have to stop working so hard, I will get to experiment with this thing that people keep talking about, self compassion. No, we actually have to get to it right now. If you asked me, what is the number one skill you work on with people to help them improve their decision making? I would answer self compassion. What is the number one thing that people are missing when they come to work with you and they leave with, and it has ripple effects into their clarity, their follow through, their capacity to make decisions for themselves and not people please, their capacity to let things be done and not need everything to be perfect, their capacity to exercise discipline, even when they're full of resistance. You guessed it. Self compassion is the common denominator here. So we got to talk about it. Today's conversation is going to focus on the truths of self compassion. And you know me, you know I love me some semantics. We got to define our terms and we have to clear up a lot of misunderstanding about this idea. And our next conversation is going to go into the how of what do we do? How do we do it? But my agenda today is to get you as on board as possible with the idea so that when we get to the how, you are interested and you care and you want to try it out. Even if you're not anti self compassion, I don't mean to assume that you are not interested out the gate. Even if you are on board with this idea, even if you're already practicing it, we're still going to talk about the truth of what self compassion is, how having it or having a lack of it is affecting your life. I'm going to ask you to look at how you're operating and just do a little inventory of some of your beliefs, some of your behaviors, so that we can either introduce self compassion for the first time or we can elevate it, expand it, maximize it if you are already experienced and you're ready to take it to the next level. So, how about we start with some Latin, shall we? Calm, passion. Calm means with, passion means suffering. So, calm passion means to be with suffering. Off the bat, I think defining this in its most basic root terms can clear up a lot of assumptions about what self compassion means and a lot of imagery that it can tend to bring up. If we accept that we are all humaning and we accept that part of humaning is suffering, then ipso facto, we have to accept that we are all suffering some of the time, she says with a smile on her face. It's just part of the deal, right? And we are not here to qualify suffering. A big pickle that people get themselves into when we start talking about self compassion is they immediately go to, my life is fine. I have it so well compared to other people. Who am I to complain? My suffering is nothing compared to other people's actual real suffering. So forget that I even started talking and I take it back. I'm not suffering at all. And I should feel fine and happy and good all the time. So we're going to take a breath because the thing about suffering is that there's enough to go around. Somebody suffering greatly over here, subjectively speaking, doesn't take away any suffering that's available to you and vice versa. So when we have a conversation about self-compassion, when we talk about your willingness or even interest in having self-compassion, we are not getting a report card out to judge your suffering. We are not checking in with how much self-compassion do you deserve? Because how bad are things really? Okay, let's go back and let's back the truck up to our original base terms. You're a human. Part of humaning is suffering. Ipso facto, you suffer. Compassion is simply the act of being with suffering. So, what we're looking at when we talk about how is self compassion functioning in your life? How is it fitting in? We're really talking about how are you being with your suffering? How are you with your own suffering to whatever degree, in whatever circumstances, no matter what they are. And the way that I phrased that was actually very important. It is the act of being with suffering. Another misconception about self compassion is that it is a feeling and it is undefinable. It is amorphous. It is like a mysterious vapor that floats into the room and now we're self compassionate, but then, no, it floats away and oh, no, we're not. Or we get this very vivid picture of somebody just like giving themselves some weird, awkward hug. Like that's the image that comes to mind when I think what 10 years ago I must have thought self compassion was. It's like, okay, let yourself off the hook for every mistake. Why don't you? And okay, we'll give yourself a little pat on the back. Like, gosh, I was judgy. Well, here we are. We got here how we got here, folks. You don't need to judge it. So that's another truth of self-compassion. It's really important to clear up. Self-compassion is a way of acting, a way of being with yourself. It's thinking thoughts, it's saying words, it's taking actions. A super fun fact about self compassion is, according to Dr. Kristen Neff, who has led the research on self compassion, there's a lot out there now. When she started in the game, there was none. So she kind of pioneered the scientification of self compassion. Her website is linked in the show notes. It is full of all of these amazing resources. It's full of exercises and practices you can do. There's a self compassion quiz. So if you are curious about dipping your toe in this stuff, I highly recommend you check that out because there's a ton of free resources and it's all science based, which people like us love. You're not in that place, or maybe you're not super excited about science stuff and research based practices like I am. Go onto YouTube and find anything by Thich Nhat Hanh about self compassion. Kristen Neff was not the first person who ever spoke about it. She's just the one whose research I'm going to reference the most in these conversations. So, according to her delicious research, there are two flavors, my words, not hers, of self compassion. Those two kinds of self compassion are tender and fierce. So, another misunderstanding about self compassion is not just that it is like lovey dovey and let yourself off the hook vibes. It is very passive. It is very inactive. It is very, woe is me, sadness, scrunched up, self hugs. And what's so fun that we're going to get into a lot more detail on is to understand the nuances of how self compassion functions and the different ways that you can exercise it. Because remember, it's not an amorphous fog that's just floating around on its own, it's action you take. And there's a tender side. There is a more still or inner version of self compassion. Admittedly, sometimes it's even feels a little disconnected for me to talk about tender things and tenderness. So if it's easier for you to conceptualize this in terms of still or inner self compassion, that's fine. That works. There is this version of being with your own suffering that is more internal. This is how you think about yourself. This is how you think about your suffering. This is how you talk to yourself. There is also, however, the fierce side of self compassion. If you want a different name, you could call it the active kind or the outer kind of self compassion. So there's the inward kind of self compassion you're directing towards yourself, and there's an outer kind of self compassion where you are taking action in the world. So before we get into the specifics about what each of those flavors of self compassion are and how it can show up in your life, I'm going to tell you some stories. A story that Dr. Kristen Neff shares in her book and along a lot of interviews that she does. That's one of her biggest examples, most visceral examples from her life of what self compassion looks like and why it's useful and what it can impact. And then I'm going to tell you some of my own personal experiences of how there's been an absence of self compassion and what difference it makes in these situations where I've actually used it because I learned what it was and why it matters. Before we go further down those roads, I want to share some of the research about self compassion just so we can know for sure why it's worth talking about, why it's worth bothering with. Because we're busy. We don't need extra homework over here, right? So, unsurprisingly, but interesting to qualify with research findings, the number one block to self compassion, and not just in America. I thought this was particularly interesting. This is in studies worldwide. The number one block to self compassion is the fear that it will undermine our motivation. The belief that exercising self compassion, even opening the door to it, cracking the window and letting a little self compassion in, will cause us to lose our edge. It'll cost us our momentum. It will ruin our future and limit our success. And you guessed it, what the research shows is that resisting self compassion, so perpetuating behaviors and self treatment and beliefs about yourself that are judgmental, critical, invalidating of your suffering, actually perpetuates this way of being where you are constantly afraid of failure because you're constantly afraid of how badly you're going to treat yourself when you fail. So you start taking smaller risks. So you don't grow as much and you don't fulfill your potential and you keep limits on yourself and you stay in your comfort zone. So, what the research shows is that this tendency towards being really harsh with yourself and using that as motivation and resisting self compassionate behavior, self compassionate self talk is not actually qualitatively more effective for your success and your progress and your thriving, which sometimes I share with my clients because there can be such an ingrained resistance to, I don't want to let myself off the hook. I don't want to let myself get away with nonsense. I don't want to throw myself a pity party. P.S. None of that is what self compassion is. So that's great news. But sometimes it really is helpful to hear the facts. And the facts are this isn't working. This way of being that we're constantly invalidating how we feel, especially if we compare ourselves to how badly other people have it, or forcing ourselves to get over something, stop feeling sorry for yourself, keep pushing forward, or shoving our own noses in some kind of failure or mistake for the purposes of getting better and keeping going. Sometimes it's really necessary and helpful to just look at the bare facts that that's not working. You're not thriving. Do you have successes? Yeah, probably. Do they feel great? Nope. Because you are terrible to yourself some of the time. Do you have as many successes and the kinds of successes that you really want and are capable of if you are employing self compassion more in your life? That's what we're here to explore. So, having this habit in place of self compassion being part of the process when you're experiencing any kind of suffering, according to the research, encourages a habit of learning. So, instead of, I failed, I made a mistake, I feel bad for some reason, and just stopping at judgment and criticism of it or invalidation and dismissal of it, if we introduce this element of self compassion, we are, research says, more prone to get something out of that experience and use it to our own advantage. And if this sounds like building resilience, then you get a gold star because that's exactly what we're talking about. There's specific studies they've done with combat soldiers who, when they practice self compassion, are less likely to experience PTSD or develop maladaptive coping addictions, and they are more likely to build resilience and use that to get through it and end up stronger. So, my hope is right now, a lot of the minions in your mind who've been called to the meeting today who are in favor of keeping the harsh self criticism, the invalidation and dismissal of feelings and thoughts about suffering. My hope is that they are a little more sold on this idea of exercising self compassion because ultimately we all want the same thing. All the minions in your mind want you to survive, thrive, succeed, feel safe, feel loved. The different departments have different methods that they think are the most effective. And that's something that's very meta about self compassion. You actually have to have compassion for your lack of or resistance to self compassion. What did I just say? If you are a person who would really love to talk to yourself a little more nicely or be a little less harsh on yourself, criticize yourself a little tiny less, maybe feel a little more on your own team, but you're aware of these habits that have been in place probably for decades to criticize yourself, be hard on yourself, push yourself. Before we just change all those habits, become a totally different person, we have to have compassion for the fact that some of the minions in your mind think that this behavior is useful. They think that this is going to help you get where you need to go and get everything that you want and be safe and be successful and feel loved. So I promised we were going to bring this back to decision making. And this is a really key point about self compassion and decision making. It is vital for us to constantly remember that for all of our decision mastery, most of our decisions are made out of habit. Most of our decisions are not conscious and deliberately thought through and signed off on by the highest CEO minion in your mind. Most of them are dictated by habit, existing patterns. Most of them are influenced by cognitive biases. And a lot of our decisions are essentially making themselves. This is why some of the least helpful advice we get when we talk about how we treat ourselves or we talk about ourselves or we think about things is just don't do that. Why would you think that? Just stop talking to yourself like that. A lot of this stuff that we are doing that doesn't work and doesn't feel good is happening on automation. So the first decision that I am actually inviting you to make with today's episode is the decision to get on board with the idea of self-compassion, to decide that you are a person who wants to have self-compassion in your life, to decide that self-compassion serves your agenda, that self-compassion is a key part of the plan to your highest success. So I'm going to invite you to make that decision right now. Decide, use your own words, decide whatever you want to decide, but I want you to make a conscious decision about what role do I want self-compassion to play in my life? Do I want to be a self-compassionate person? Do I want to get better at self-compassion or less resistant to it? Do I want to experiment with it and see if it really does make me a lazy failure like I'm afraid it will? Starting from this decision, whatever it is today, is going to help you start changing the habits that you have in place because you're going to be able to constantly come back to, oh, yeah, I decided I want to be a person who uses self compassion to succeed. Oh, yeah, that's right. I was just beating myself up in my head. And we've decided that we want to try new ways of talking to ourselves. It's not going to make your behavior change instantly overnight. It is going to make it easier to recognize when you are being self-critical or self-dismissive and come back to this awareness over and over and over again that, oh yeah, I want to be with my suffering in a different way than I have for the past 30 years. So let's talk about some real life stories. Let's bring this into reality and look at what difference does this actually make in real life and in the decisions we make. There's a story that Dr. Neff shares in her book about being on a long flight with her 5-year-old son who has autism. The way she explains it, they turned the lights out very abruptly, which triggered her son having a massive, very loud tantrum and not being immediately consolable. She takes him to get into the bathroom to see if that can be like a contained space for the tantrum. The bathroom is occupied. So there she is in the middle of a plane full of people trying to sleep as they're flying across the Atlantic. And her 5-year-old son is just screaming his head off. And she doesn't feel like there's anything that she can do. So what did she do? She went into full self compassion mode. The way she describes it, she said, there was nothing else for me to do. I couldn't make him stop. I couldn't apologize to every person on the plane and change whatever they might be thinking or feeling. All I could do to affect how I was feeling and affect my circumstances was exercise self compassion. So she got them both down on the floor and he was having his tantrum moment in his space and she made sure he was safe. And she said she put her hand on her heart and started talking to herself. She says that I probably looked crazy. And at that point, I could care less because she was in such stress, in such suffering that she just decided to be with her suffering. And she was telling herself, this is so hard. I'm so sorry. She was just with her suffering. What she describes happening next is her awareness moving from the pain to the love she was feeling for the pain because she created such feelings of support and care in that moment for herself by exercising self compassion that she says her predominant experience changed from stressful chaos to an experience of feeling supported, feeling cared for. Let's just pause right there and think about wow, how aware are we of our capacity to change our experience, to change our experience of a situation that is largely out of our control, and how big a role self compassion can play in that? She goes on to share that changing her state in that way to this calmer, self compassionate state impacted her son and ended up calming his state down. Isn't that interesting? That's not why she did it. She didn't exercise self compassion on the condition that it made him stop crying and it made her feel better and it made things look objectively better. She did it because she was suffering and her options were be with her suffering or abandon herself in that moment of suffering and totally melt into the stress or react to it and amp it up, which would have created very different results. So I want to tell you some of my story because self-compassion was it's like a sleeper skill for me. It wasn't something that I was ever eager to learn or get good at. I was totally in that camp of yeah, I get it. We should be nice for ourselves. First of all, I haven't worked hard enough to deserve that. I have no legitimate suffering to speak of. And I haven't succeeded enough yet. I can't start like just being all soft with myself. Like I haven't gotten there yet. I haven't earned that. So if you have any of that flavor of thinking, know that it's normal and you're not alone. And remember what we talked about the research thing with how effective that way of thinking is. I also want to share my experience to show you the difference it can make when you experiment with a different perspective. So I used to be a person who was very verbally harsh with myself. I remember, I have a terrible memory. I don't know if we talked about this, but before the last 6 or 7 years, it was very hazy. I do have very, very clear snippets of certain memory moments in my mind. And there are a couple that stand out when I talk about how I used to give myself these verbal lashing. I remember one time specifically, I was probably going to be late for rehearsal and it was probably rush hour and I was probably supposed to have left 15 minutes prior. I was looking for my keys I couldn't find my keys in my apartment. This is when I was living in West LA, and my theater was in Culver City. If you had a recording, if you had like a bug in my apartment at the time and you played the recording back of me looking for my keys for those, I don't know, 5 minutes, you would have think that I was talking to someone who set fire to a million of my dollars. I was talking to myself like I was the stupidest, most worthless, idiotic, just absolute pile of garbage, dumbest thing on the planet because I didn't know where I put my keys. I also used to have weird conversations with myself, often while driving. I am a talker to myself. I've always talked to myself out loud. I find that it's particularly active in grocery stores for whatever reason. But some of those conversations I remember having with myself driving somewhere where I was leaving something where I'd said something stupid. I had made a bad impression of myself. I had put my foot in my mouth. I'd done something. And I must have been curious about why, because my conversation was like, how could you be so stupid? Why would you do that? And then I answered my own question. Well, because you're a freaking idiot. Like, you've never made a good decision in your entire life. You're a complete failure. It's too late for you to do anything worthwhile. And again, you're a human dumpster fire. Now, these were not examples of me trying to motivate myself, right? These are examples of me dismissing and invalidating my feelings. Remember what we're talking about self compassion being opposite these patterns that we can have of either being super self critical and hard on ourselves to motivate ourselves to success, or these patterns of being really dismissive and invalidating of our suffering. So, this is an example of how I was just not even aware of the fact that I was having any suffering. In my mind, it was the honest to God, blanket, objective truth that I had messed up and I was garbage and I needed to make sure I told myself so. So, why does this matter for decision making? Why do we care if we are verbally abusive to ourselves, invalidating of our feelings, dismissive of our suffering, ignorant of our suffering? Why does it matter? Remember when we talked about the studies that showed that a lack of self compassion perpetuated a fear of failure, a fear of how badly you were going to treat yourself if you failed? So it limited risk taking. I really experienced that. It's almost like you're walking on eggshells with yourself because you don't want to set yourself off and trigger another verbal lashing from yourself. So day to day, you really get nervous about making a mistake, letting yourself down, doing something quote unquote stupid, which I think that ends up feels constrictive. No wonder I had anxiety. No wonder I was a perfectionist for so long. If we zoom out, though, my larger life decisions were also impacted. I didn't feel like it was safe to sincerely question my career path and explore other options. I didn't feel like I was capable of that or deserved it. I was really nervous about making a mistake and choosing wrong and getting the verbal lashing times 10 because now we're not just losing our keys, we're messing with our income and our success and our identity. It really put a limit on what decisions I thought I was even allowed to consider, let alone attempt. And it's the only factor that played into what decisions I made, but it was a big one. And I think it's very easy for people to look at the decisions they're not making. I'm not quitting my job. I'm not starting my business. I'm not writing my book. I'm not telling my sister I don't want to host her kid's birthday party at my house and think, well, I should just be able to make this decision. Why is it so hard? Why isn't it easier? But if there's an element of suffering that is either being judged or being invalidated because there's an absence of self compassion going on, it is going to impact those decisions. It is going to make them harder than they appear like they should be on paper. So, what happened for me was I was introduced to this revolutionary idea that you can speak to yourself and think about yourself and relate to your suffering in any kind of deliberate way that maybe doesn't involve words like a human garbage fire. And I started learning how to witness my own behavior and my own thoughts with this in mind. We're going to get into this in our next conversation. So don't worry, we're going to talk about the how. But I want to give you a sneak peek of what happens on the other side of the how when you get good at it, when it becomes second nature, because it honestly is second nature for me now to relate
There's
to my suffering, to relate to my thoughts and feelings about myself and about my circumstances in a self compassionate way. One thing that is dramatically changed, and I will tell you this is possible because I am living proof that it's possible, is I do not speak to myself in the way I used to at all, ever. I took that language off the table. Not only did I recognize this is not effective, it's not accomplishing anything that we think it is, or it might someday, I realized what I was missing. That when we're in that mode of being harsh with ourselves and giving ourselves those verbal lashings, we don't notice that we are not talking to ourselves like we're friends, talking to ourselves in any kind of complimentary, positive, celebratory, accepting, validating, loving, supportive way. We don't notice what we're missing. When I noticed, hey, you don't have any voices in your head telling you you're doing a good job at all throughout your day. You don't have any voices in your head saying, hey, you don't feel good right now. That sucks. I'm here for you. When I realized, oh man, I am not on my own team. And that feels terrible. And I'm waiting to earn it. I'm waiting to work hard enough to win it somehow in this game of life I made up in my head. That's what changed for me. That's when I took that language off the table and I decided we don't talk to ourselves like that anymore. And I replaced it with this other kind of talk. We already said it's not effective to just tell yourself, stop doing something, stop being some way. So, if this is one of the habits you want to change, we're going to talk about how exactly to do it next week. I want you to know it's so possible. And not like, yeah, I only beat myself up sometimes now. I do have self doubt. I'm going to talk about that next. I have lots of anxiety. I'm a catastrophizer. I've had imposter thinking come in and set up shop in my head sometimes. But the verbal lashing, the ways I used to talk to myself without even giving a second thought, you're such an idiot. You're so worthless. You're such a dummy. Not even allowed to joke about it. Non negotiable. So that has had a phenomenal ripple effect on my decisions. Because whatever decision I might be mulling over or even struggling with, there is not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that I will remain on my own team no matter what. That fear that used to constrain what decisions I even thought were available to me is not there. Fear of other stuff. We're not pretending about that. But the fear that I'm going to abandon myself in moments of suffering, man, does that feel good to not have that constantly running in the background. And boy, does it open up decisions that wouldn't be on the table otherwise. The other difference it's made to build up my skill set in self compassion has been in how I relate to self doubt, imposter thinking, fear about failing, because I can still want to be my harshest critic when it comes to things that I think are worth criticizing, right? If I'm looking at like my monthly revenue or how many podcast downloads did I get or what did you do to promote your business this week? I can want to show up as my employee self, full of apologies and self deprecation. But like, I didn't do enough. I didn't do enough. I didn't do that. That wasn't as good as it could have been. I definitely didn't give that enough time. And then I can want to hand out a good scolding as my CEO self. I can turn around and look at my employee self and say, wow, big fat fail this month, huh? Well, this business is never going to work and your life is going to fail and you're going to crumble and die probably. And it's your fault. So these are actual conversations that my brain has with itself. But the difference is now that I have self compassion inserted in there, it's like a Chrome extension, if we want to get super nerdy about the analogies. I still am in that same circumstance, but I have a different experience about it. Remember how Dr. Neff's predominant experience of the plane shifted from one of stress and anxiety to one of feeling cared for and supported. The same shift happens for me in moments where I would want to go on a self-doubting, self-critical rant. I remember, one of these this visceral memory moments. I remember having a thought and noticing a thought in my head that I'm just not doing enough and I'm failing everywhere. And here's how that experience went with the self compassion extension. It was super painful because when you believe it, stuff is super painful. And the fear that I'm not going to actually be able to turn this into a real business and pay bills and respect myself and make a positive impact. Like that fear was real. And the criticism was well intentioned. It was like, you're failing. We're not going to fake it. And what came out of my mouth, because like I said, you know me, I'm a talker to myself. What came out of my mouth was, I know I think it's important to judge myself as a failure right now. And I also know I don't need to believe it. And I get chills thinking about this because it was a very visceral moment. It was an uneventful day. It was an unimportant moment in time, but it was a very visceral experience for me where I was acutely aware of the suffering. And I didn't just talk myself out of it. I didn't just say, I shouldn't think that, or that's not a helpful thought, or just believe in yourself. I was really able to be with my suffering in that moment because I didn't have any other option. I couldn't solve the feeling by going and doing 10 hours of work. That was not going to solve that feeling. And I couldn't shut it down because I don't shut down my feelings anymore. I don't invalidate my feelings anymore. I know that's not productive. I know it doesn't feel good. I know it's not good for my health. So all I could do was just tell myself, I know I think it's important to focus on what I think is a failure and think that I'm not doing enough. I know I think this is important and true. And I know I don't have to believe it. Notice how I already explained this impacted my decision making. Because I could have decided, oh my gosh, you're right. Let's go do 10 hours of work. Let's not eat, no bathroom breaks. Let's just power through. Let's do the probably crappiest work we can because we're motivated from a place of entire scarcity. Could have made that decision. Could have also decided to totally indulge the drama of my thoughts, amp up my stress, and throw myself a pity party. Yeah, I am a failure. Let's just concentrate on how I'm a failure for the next 6 hours. I could have made a decision to quit my job. I could have made a decision that, yeah, this feels terrible. And the way I'm going to react to this terrible feeling is to shut my business down and declare myself a failure and do something else. Now, I'm not saying it would have been bad and incorrect to choose any of those things. I'm saying look at what an impact self compassion can have on what decisions you end up making. When I was really able to be with my suffering in that moment, this inconsequential moment when I was just like in the hallway, it helped reinforce the new system that I wanted to be in place in my life, which is you operate with self compassion. So, whenever you hear doubts in your mind about how good something is, or how worthwhile something's going to be, or how well you showed up, you're going to grain of salt that shit. You're going to experience those thoughts and those doubts and those fears and those criticisms with self compassion. It doesn't mean they're going to stop happening. But self compassion has to be a non negotiable part of how you experience them from now on. And do you know what happens now? Do you know what I'm experiencing now that I'm not new to self compassion? Is I just save myself a ton of time and energy. I don't find myself wasting hours and days and weeks conversing with critical thoughts or going down self doubt rabbit holes because self compassion has been folded into my regular way of thinking and my inner dialogue. Those are very quick conversations. I got to hear the concern, like, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if this is going to be a failure or success or make any difference in anybody's life. And I was like, yeah, all right, that's fair. That's valid. Minimal to no drama. What I'm trying to illustrate here is I have doubts. I have fears. I have anxieties. I'm a theater kid, you guys. I'm never going to not have a dramatic brain. But I've found in hindsight, I essentially ran two experiments. I ran an experiment where I lived a version of life without self compassion. I didn't talk to myself well. I didn't validate my feelings. I was my harshest critic. And I saw the results that created. The data's in. And I've now been running this experiment for over 6 years where I try to do life with self compassion. And we got some good data in so far. I have made more money than I ever did in the other version. That's cool. I have more of a sense of myself and who I am and what I want. That's kind of useful and important. I've made more of a positive impact on people, the world, which I didn't even, if I ever did that in the before times, it was completely on accident. I've built resilience and made it through challenging circumstances in my personal life and in my professional world with a little bit of grace, with my health mostly intact. The version of myself and the version of my life that I've been able to create with self compassion versus without it, I don't think there's any contest. So, a lot of food for thought today. I really want you to consider how self compassion is functioning in your life these days. Think about, what role do I want self compassion to play in my life? And think how it's going to impact your decision making, because it will. And I'm excited to get into the how of it with you in the next episode. I just want to thank you for being open to this conversation today. I want to thank you for being open to being a little more on your own team. Makes literally all the difference in the entire world. And if you did leave a rating and review as part of the giveaway celebration last week, thank you so much. It's not too late to give a rating and review. The prizes are over, but your opportunity to share with me what you get out of the podcast and what you want more of, that's always on the table. So it's a quick scroll to the bottom of Apple Podcasts to click the 5 stars. Leave a quick review with your thoughts. I will be so, so grateful. And I hope you have a beautiful weekend. I can't wait to talk to you more next week. Keep the self-compassion going. See you then.
Hey, want to find out your decision style? Obviously, go take the decision style quiz. It's in the show notes and at kirstenparker.com/quiz. We all have our style when it comes to making decisions, but do you know how to use your default way of thinking to your advantage? Or do you mainly get stuck in the most annoying parts of overthinking and people pleasing? The decision style quiz has your answers, my friend. Take it right now at kirstenparker.com/quiz.